We can't stick to what we know when time is pushing us forward. I wanna make sure.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Certainly didn't hear very much from the distilleries involved, but a couple of them I wasn't particularly complimentary about, I suppose, so it's not a big surprise. Yeah, slightly controversial, I suppose, but nothing wrong with a bit of controversy. And talking of controversy, you may well have read the recent report in the Financial Times that the distillery Ardbeg recently sold a cask. You're probably thinking, well, what's the big deal? Distilleries sell casks all the time. Yeah, but not this one. It was a cask that was just a sherry butt that filled in 1975, and they sold it to an unnamed person, woman in actual fact, for £16 million. I'll just pause there to let that sink in. 16 million. I mean, Jesus Christ, you can bloody build an entire distillery for that kind of money. I mean, that's just mad. I mean, what made me laugh was that a spokesman for Ardbeg said we had to seriously think about this. For how long? 5 minutes? I mean, somebody's giving you £16 million. You're not going to go, nah, sorry, we don't want to sell it. I mean, you know, even if you've got an absolute wodge of money, you don't need the money, you're not going to turn down £16 million. And, you know, I mean, it's just nuts, really, isn't it? But, you know, I mean, if somebody wants to spend £16 million on a cask of Ardbeg for their personal use, I've got no problem with that. They've obviously got a lot more disposable income than sort of the vast majority of us. And so, yeah, I've got no problem with Ardbeg sort of doing that. I mean, that's fine. I mean, you know, you just don't blame them for doing that. They've got, obviously, well, I don't know how many casks of sort of like pre-80s stock, but, you know, but 16 million is just nuts. I mean, you know, Diageo sold a couple of casks of Port Ellen and Brewer at auction recently. I think they went for about, what, £800,000-900,000 a pop, you know. I mean, you can argue that that's a bit sort of blatant profiteering, but, you know, if people want to spend that sort of money on stuff, then fine. Now, the problem is, or the issue that I have with that sale, is that it sets a ridiculous precedent, especially for these whiskey investment companies. You know, that you see all these lavish ads and brochures saying whiskey has gone up over 500% in the last 10 years, and you think, well, yeah, where's your data coming from? I know what casks are doing the rounds on the independent market, and I can tell you what, a cask of sort of like the stuff that's going around ain't going to get you 500% in 10 years or however long. I mean, that, you know, I'm sorry, but casks of Craigalachy and Brackler and, you know, yes, they're going to go up in value, no doubt about that, but you ain't going to get that kind of level of returns on that. And it just adds fuel to the fire of these bogus companies that basically are just ripping people off, saying, look, we have these casks, when in reality, of course, they haven't got them at all. I mean, yeah, all right, you can argue that these kind of scams have been going on for sort of like donkey's years, but, you know, it's just getting to the ridiculous point now where these scams seem to be happening on such a regular basis. And if you are going to invest in casks, personally, I would suggest don't bother. If you want to invest in whiskey, buy bottles, buy something physical you can have in your hand, and just, you know, if it looks too good to be true, as the old adage goes, it probably is. So, yeah, I mean, all right, if you're going to invest in casks, do your due diligence. Make sure you know who the people are behind the company. Make sure they're reputable. But frankly, I honestly wouldn't bother. Not unless you just want to do it for a bit of fun, invest some money for, you know, to bottle for yourself, for friends, family, all that kind of stuff, and you're not particularly interested in making any money out of it. Fine, got no problem with that whatsoever. But if you are looking to make money, then I really don't think sort of buying casks, and definitely not putting money into schemes is the way to do it. But anyway, that's just a my personal opinion. Like I said, if you want to invest in whiskey, buy the physical bottles. Anyway, enough of that. This week's episode of the show. I thought it was about time to do an episode of the show on Kilkerran, or the Glengyle distillery, as the case may be. I've collected together a number of samples, including this I found ligging in a box. Work in progress number 2. This was, well, bottled about, 11 years ago. The sample is actually still in remarkably good condition, considering, well, I think very much of it, and it's been sat in a box somewhere. But anyway, the bulk of the samples come courtesy of my good friend Ian Sunderland. So big thank you to Ian for the samples, or most of the samples for today's episode of the show. And I just thought, yeah, it's about time I haven't done a Glengyle Kilkerran episode for quite some time. It'll get the views, I know, which is really cool. Hopefully it will, get a few more subscribers. I think we're up to about 2,100 now. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. That would be really cool. Of course, any comments I do make during today's episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me, just to get that one out of the way. So, not a great deal to say about the distillery. You probably know a damn sight more about the distillery, or a lot of you probably know more about the distillery than I do. And, the information is out there, so I'm just going to crack on with the lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with, like I said, Work in Progress 2. The spirit at the time was 6 years old. I bottled, I believe, in 2010, certainly. I first tasted it in August of 2010, so going to be a nice starting point. And we're going to really jump up the edge. Okay, it's a bit of a weird jump, but anyway, next bottling we're looking at is a 15-year-old single Madeira cask. This was bottled for Taiwan. The code is 9/374, distilled in May of 2004, bottled in September of 2019 at 51.1%. Next bottling we'll be looking at is the last year's 2021 16-year-old, bottled at 46%. It was aged 75% bourbon, 25% sherry. The bottling code is 21134 and was bottled, I believe, in September of last year. Next sample we're moving on to is never been bottled, as far as I know. It was an under the counter sample in a sort of like a brown paper bag. Ooh, you want to taste something? It's apparently from Port Cask 169, which was distilled in 2011. So I have no idea what the ABV is. It was probably around about 9 or 10 years when the sample was drawn. So just thought it would be just an interesting one to have a look at. And we're on to the final two, which is, I suppose, really the reason behind doing the Kilkerran episode of the show. So I have two batches of the heavily peated, batch number 4, which was 80% bourbon, 20% sherry from last year, bottled at 58.6%, and the current release, or the release that's just happened earlier this year, of batch number 6 at 57.4, 75% bourbon, 25% sherry. Now, a lot of people have been sort of saying that, it's getting really quite evolved now. We'll see, shall we say, because, shall we say, heavily peated has been, what's the politically correct terminology? A bit of a challenging dram, I think. Shall we say? That is being slightly politically correct, I believe. So it'll be interesting to see whether the people that are saying that it's now actually showing more evolution now that it's probably about 6 years old, I guess. I think it was first bottled in 2019. So I would guess that sort of batch 4 was about 5 and batch 6 should be about 6 years old. So I think that's going to be an interesting end. So lots of cask strength bottlings. Let's just kick off with the old one then, shall we? Right, okay, so benchmark bottling, work in progress 2, 6 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us. Young, obviously, fresh, quite citric, quite grassy. Now it is showing a bit more oak than I remember, and there is a little bit of oxidation, which I'm guessing is because of the sample rather than the actual spirit. But I can see through that, and I can see the fresh gristiness, saltiness. I thought it was a lovely bottling at such a young age, and you know, it's got a little bit of peat. Yeah, just a lovely young fresh whiskey, I think. See what pounds right now. Smooth, rounded, slightly oily, cereally, bit of citrus, bit of grassiness coming through on the mid palate. Some nice fruit, sort of nascent fruit, shall we say, sort of tangerine, apricot, pear possibly. Bit of background, a bit more oak than I remember, and there is that slight oxidation on there, which I think has come from the sample over time, rather than that was how it was. But it's young, it's fresh, and you know, just a lovely whiskey at the end of the day. And it certainly went to show that Kilkerran could certainly get away with being bottled at 6 years old. Stick a load of peat with it, and we'll see, shall we? But anyway, nice start. So let's move on to the Madeira cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Very Madeira, very biscuity, doughy, bready. So we've got that sort of almost kind of Ben Nevis-y kind of character happening. Buttered toast, oily vanilla, little bit of almost kind of orange conserve. Yeah, not a lot of spirit character happening here. This is all pretty much oak. There's quite a bit of peat smoke in actual fact. There's got a slight astringency there. Slightly smoky, but you know, there's a fair amount of peat happening here, which is kind of giving it that astringency, which is kind of offsetting to a certain extent the sweetness of the Madeira. So I quite like this. I think it's got just about enough balance. See what pass on. Right, well, it kicks off with the Madeira as kind of expected, sort of biscuity, rich, sweet, quite malty. If I'm being sort of really critical, there is a slight plastic note coming through on the mid palate. It's kind of wrapped up in that sort of oaky kind of marzipan, slight marzipan-y honey, almondy honey. But there is a slight plasticiness to the edge of that. A little bit of peat smoke, touch of white chocolate on the finish, again honeyed, again pretty much all about the Madeira cask. The spirit really has kind of has attempted to fight through it. I mean, certainly, although it's not what I would call particularly high ABV, the alcohol certainly does kind of nip through on the mid palate and the finish. So yeah, okay, you can argue there is a little bit of distillery character happening there, but pretty much it's all about the cask. And like I said, there is that sort of slight, wouldn't say off note, well, I probably would actually, because it like I say, that slight plasticiness on the mid palate. Okay, so let's move on to the 16-year-old. So 75% bourbon, 25% sherry. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then. Well, the sherry is punching above its weight, shall we say. It opens up with a lot of Oloroso dried fruit, tobacco, leather, touch of peat, touch of creamy American oak, hazelnut, almond. Once it settles down a bit, it does act. The balance does kind of come back into shape, shall we say? Like I said, it kicks off with the sort of immediacy of the Oloroso, but like I said, it settles down to give you some sort of like nice broad, rich, malty spirit character. Salt, minerals, bit of fish oil, touch of American oak. Nice nose. That is a good nose. I really like that, and I know quite a few of you managed to get hold of a bottle. So if you did, see what pals like. That's a nice chewy finish. That's got a lovely progression. Again, like the nose, kicks off with the Oloroso, dried fruits, tar, licorice, a little bit of peat. American oak kind of comes through on the mid palate subtly and a little bit on the short side. In essence, not the finish, but the American oak coming through is kind of sandwiched between the sherry, shall we say. So it kind of comes back to the sherry fairly quickly. It's got a lovely creaminess on the finish, touch of spice, marzipan, earth. I think it's pretty well balanced actually. I mean, alright, you could argue that the sherry influence is a little bit more on the palate, and like I said, the progression is although it has progression, is a little bit, I wouldn't say, it's a bit short, you know, it's sherry, boom, American oak, back to sherry. But I think that's a gorgeous whiskey. Lovely mouthfeel, lovely oiliness, malty, really lovely long aftertaste. That sort of maltiness is just lingering with the sort of the Oloroso dried fruit. And, you know, I mean, I keep saying it, I don't hate sherry. You know, I think sherry used in the right proportions adds, you know, interest, and I'm all about the balance at the end of the day, as you well know, and as I keep saying, you know, don't care whether it's American oak or sherry or whatever, you know, I like progression and I like balance. That's what I'm looking for in a whiskey, and that has it.
This shadow has become a
Okay, so I'm actually quite surprised. I mean, look at that, how light that is for a port cask. So I'm guessing a refilled port cask, bloody refilled port cask, I think. It's practically imparted no colour whatsoever. But anyway, let's see what the nose gives us. It's young, tobacco-y, leathery, quite peated, quite intense. Feels a lot younger than 10, it has to be said. There's manure, straw. It's got some almost kind of red cherry notes, dark chocolate. I'd guess probably high 50s ABV. You can certainly feel the alcohol. I mean, it's not too spiky. It's a bit straightforward at this present moment in time. I can see why. I think there's been a couple of 15-year-olds port cask bottlings, so I can see why this would probably be better left for a few more years. It's got a really nice earthy intensity. It doesn't have the softness of the 16-year-old. It's got a more kind of grittiness to it, shall we say. So this is probably leading on to the heavily peated quite nicely, I think. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. More port influence on the palate, gritty, chocolatey, dried fruits, slightly darker dried fruits, darker cherry, black cherry, malt, quite intense, quite alcoholic, it's quite masked, some salt, quite a bit of peat coming through on the mid palate, still fairly young, although not quite as I wouldn't quite say the nose was fainty, but there's certainly sort of less of a youthful kind of characteristic on the palate. It does seem more evolved on the palate, although it's still quite tight, quite alcoholic, slightly tannic on the finish, but again it's juicy. Port is not too heavy, nicely balanced. Yeah, I think obviously it just goes to show that Kilkerran or the Glengyle can handle a bit of port, and like I said, this is pretty much refill port. It's certainly not a first fill port barrique by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, let's see what a bit of water does to it. Little soapiness, less port character now on the nose. I mean, there wasn't a great deal of port character to start off with, it has to be said. So we're kind of in sort of spirit territory, and it's a little bit lacking. It just hasn't kind of found its feet yet on the nose. The nose is still just a sort of a little bit raw, should we say. Yeah, there's a little bit of barley now, a little bit of sweetness, some lemon possibly. Yeah, I think this needs a few more years yet. Let's see what the palate's like. Still showing a bit more port, or more port than the nose. Although it's not a port monster by any stretch of the imagination. Really peppery now, actually. I get a lot of pepper. It's a tad on the short side now. Still quite young, and it kind of, again, is backing up my kind of theory that this really needs a few more years. Or it needs to be re-racked into another port cask. I think, don't know whether that's going to develop a lot more port character in sort of 3, 4, 5 years time. Who knows? It'll certainly sort of lose some of that rawness. But yeah, overall, yep, pleasant bottling. Right, okay, time to tackle some heavily peated. So this is batch number 4, 58.6. Let's see what the nose gives us. Whew, yeah, young, raw, fainty, peaty, rubbery, cigar smoke, ash. There is some sweetness underneath that. There is a raw, I mean, it's kind of work in progress, or peat in progress as the case may be. There is a sweetness lurking beneath that, and getting some vanilla coming through now. There's a little bit of dried fruit sat in the background. It's becoming a bit mentholated. Yeah, it's challenging, but you know, you can see an end point here when this really does kind of come together. And I think sort of 8, 10 maybe, you'll just start to sort of see the drop off in the rawness. And if it kind of holds together with this bedrock of fairly rich fruit, I think this is going to be a really spectacular bottling. At the moment, it's a little unruly, although certainly from memory it's less unruly than the earlier releases, it has to be said. But anyway, let's see what passes on. Whoa, as the French would say, that's a bit sauvage. That's raw, that's intense, that's a lot rawer than the nose kind of gives on. The alcohol is masking it completely. I mean, the mid palate and the finish is just, there isn't one really. It's astringent, it's ashy, it's really not giving an awful lot away, to be bluntly honest with you. There's a bit of barley, there's a bit of rubber, there's a bit of smoke, but it's all, you know, it's just unevolved. That is raw, and it's kind of, it's fun, but you know, the nose seemed to give the impression that this wasn't going to be quite as raw and intense as it turns out to be. And this is often the thing with whiskey. You know, a lot of blenders and bottlers will nose the whiskey rather than taste it. I mean, if you're nosing, you can't taste sort of every cask if you're doing a batch of them, but and this is why some whiskies get bottled, because you stick your nose in and you think, well, actually, yeah, that's not too bad, that's pretty evolved, and then the palate kind of like goes, Anyway, again, it's brought out the sweeter barley notes, some lemon. It's still got some faintiness, but the sweetness is more prevalent. I mean, it's actually, dare I say it, not a bad. No, I mean, it's not a bad whiskey. I mean, I'm probably being disingenuous, I guess, a little bit. And it's got that lovely youthful peaty character. It's got that kind of ashy, malty, peaty sort of thing going on. A little bit of lanolin coming out now. I mean, it's fun. I mean, it has to be said. Let's see what that's like now. More oiliness now, more oily spirit character. Again, quite malty. Less peat, although that peat has got a sweet edge to it now. A little bit more barley, possibly. I mean, it's still pretty short. There's really no real finish to it whatsoever. It's still kind of like, pretty much all up front. Bit of charred oak kind of coming through on the finish. Don't get a great deal of sherry. Don't really get a great deal of American oak, to be bluntly honest with you. It is pretty much... I mean, those casks were fairly well used, I imagine, because it really is pretty much all spirit orientated, which not a bad thing, I suppose, but maybe a bit more sort of active wood might have given it a bit more sweetness. I don't know. It's just kind of in progress, really. So it's a snapshot, if you like, of Glengyle's peated spirit at about 6 years of age, 5 years of age. So.
Can't stay to what we know when time is pushing us forward.
Right, okay, so let's move on to batch 6. Now, this is kind of interesting for me because, as I often say, I tend to taste all these whiskies in kind of isolation. There's very rarely will I it's only when I do episodes of the show that I actually get to taste them all together, so to speak, and you get more of a kind of a broader feel when you're doing that kind of thing. And certainly if you're tasting sort of batches, it does kind of give you more of an impression because you're having to rely on your memory to a certain extent. Anyway, that's still pretty raw. Okay, an extra year hasn't done a great deal, it has to be said. Did I just get a whiff of banana then? Alright, there's a bit more estery fruit. Again, it's kind of, I can see the similarities with batch 4 in the nose feels a little bit more revolved, but it's still young, it's still raw. There's still a sort of slight metallic faintiness. It's not quite as raw, so yes, I think there is obviously some noticeable, well, I use the term maturity loosely here, going on. Oh, that peat is quite stinky, it has to be said. Quite manurey now. It's got a sort of greenness there as well, almost like cardamom. I mean, that's got a lovely complexity, don't get me wrong, and it's fun as it is. But I really think that I think this. I'm really waiting until this gets to about 10, to be bluntly honest with you. Anyway, let's see what passes on now. That's raw, that's intense. Is there some sort of a little bit more maturity? Possibly. There's more oak character on this. I'm certainly getting toasty American oak on the finish and a little bit of dried fruit. So I will say that that there is more oak, but that's just the barrel selection rather than anything to do with the age of the spirit. Bit of sweet barley. Again, there's that sort of metallic note in the aftertaste. It is still unruly, it has to be said. I mean, it's good fun. I don't think I'd want to drink much more than a glass of it, to be bluntly honest with you. It's green, it's got that green wood, green astringency, green peat kind of character, sort of on the aftertaste. I mean, it is what it is at the end of the day. And it's, I suppose, to a certain extent, difficult to say that it has majorly evolved. I mean, it's only an extra year. It's certainly got more wood character than batch number 4. Whether it's really any more evolved, of course, is debatable. Again, the nose the peat has kind of almost disappeared now. It's sort of slightly more dustier, and yes, all right, there's a bit more richness to the nose, a little bit more apricot, and less of that sort of off the still faintiness. So yeah, okay, I can go with there is a little bit more evolution. I mean, there's got to be a little bit more evolution. I mean, it's an extra year old, isn't it, or there or thereabouts. See what that's like. Oilier, rounder, slightly more fishier, less peat, less kind of green as well. A little bit more rubbery, slight soapiness, still quite raw, a little bit of faints, a bit bitter on the aftertaste. Touch more oak, as expected, a little bit more vanilla, but not a huge amount. Again, the oak is pretty much playing second fiddle to the spirit character, which is, again, not an issue. Has it evolved? Well, yeah, a little bit, I think. We're slowly edging to where I think it will be a comfortable sort of comfortable experience. I mean, as it's fun. But you know, it's quite aptly named. It's Peat in Progress.
Into this science place, I'll kiss the surface of you.
Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, personally, I thought it was a lot of fun. Big fan of Glengyle. I certainly, you know, love their spirit, and it certainly doesn't hang around these days, it has to be said, but none of the Springbank bottlings do. They actually never make it to the shelves of a certain whisky merchant. Not that I'm complaining. I mean, you know, I just wish I could get hold of more of it so that I could be a bit more generous with you guys that want to purchase it. But unfortunately, I have to sort of do what I have to do at the end of the day. Anyway, so work in progress too. Okay, I will admit I think the sample has degraded a little bit over time. Not a surprise really, but it still showed how lovely and how Kilkerran could be bottled at quite such a young age. It was, you know, all right, maybe not the most complex of spirits on the face of the planet, but it was certainly very, very enjoyable. The Madeira, I think, a little bit too much overt cask character and not enough spirit character for my own personal taste. And there was that slight plasticky note on the sort of like the palate, which kind of like, yeah, just kind of like jarred, shall we say. And I know I'm being sort of overly critical, but well, that's my job, isn't it, really? You know, I'm not going to sort of say everything's wonderful in the garden when a thorn is sticking in your ass, so to speak. So, yeah. Interesting, not quite there. The 2021 release 16-year-old, spot on, absolutely gorgeous. If you got hold of a bottle of that, well, that is a lovely dram. It has everything I look for in a whiskey. It has complexity, it has balance, and it had progression. And what more can you ask for? The port. Yeah, okay, it's obviously not ready for bottling yet. It obviously needs a few more years. But it's interesting to see that sort of obviously the spirit has the cojones to kind of handle, well, refilled port, pretty refilled port, I would imagine. So yeah, an interesting sample. Heavily peated, batch number 4. Yeah, okay, fun. Bit on the raw side, as you could say with number 6. Difficult to kind of like draw a huge amount of conclusions because there was certainly more active oak in batch number 6 over batch number 4, and yeah, okay, there is a sort of a semblance of less rawness, I suppose, about batch number 6, but it's still pretty raw, and I still think it has got a few years to go as yet, but it's fun at the end of the day. And you know, although it's not probably a whiskey that I'd want to drink sort of like 24/7, it's certainly sort of, you know, an end of the evening sort of wakey kind of dram, I think. And well, we all need them from time to time, don't we? So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Certainly think it's been a whole load of fun. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, and it will obviously spark some comments and debate and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, not a great deal else to say apart from good afternoon and good ramming.